Meeting the being of light, what to expect. As you're listening to YouTube videos on the near-death experience, you will hear that a lot of people encounter a being of light. If you go to a near-death experience conference or a weekend where they're sharing their stories, they oftentimes describe this being of light, and they all sort of just acknowledge that he exists and they've met him. They don't really know what to describe him as. Some refer to the being of light as an it, because they can't really describe it as a he or a she. It's very much, it just is, it exists. And for the purposes of my own language understanding, I will describe the being of light as he. What is interesting is when these people describe this being of light, it's very much ineffable, which means that they cannot put words to it. You can tell a true NDE experiencer when they start getting choked up, they can't find the words, they start going kind of in a trance-like state as they even try and describe what it was like for them to meet and talk to this being of light. And so he very much is the God of the near-death experience community. They just talk about him as the being of light, and that's how they know him. And so let's just describe what that's like. Oftentimes the story goes like this. You know, they pop out of their body. They've died in some wet manner where the blood stops going to their brain. And then they look around them, and as they get disinterested in the earth plane, they see a little bit of light off in the distance. And that light is attractive to them, and they start feeling drawn to it. And they start entering this tunnel of light. And as they start entering this tunnel of light, they feel waves of love and pleasure almost instantly. That as soon as they're in the light, they start experiencing this very euphoric ecstasy. It's just like incredible joy, incredible sense of comfort and being safe. They're not afraid. Their fears just dissolve. And then they're kind of ushered up this tunnel. And guess what's at the very end of the tunnel? It is the being of light. And oftentimes, as the story goes, it doesn't happen for all NDEs, but a large number of them feature meeting the being of light as one of the best memories and the most life-transformative memories of the entire experience. And they look at this, and their first thoughts are, wow, I can see you, but my eyes are not getting hurt because I've never seen this light that is so bright. They describe it as the brightest, whitest, most intense light they've ever imagined, and you can't even imagine it. They said it's 1,000 times brighter than the sun. And they're standing before the light, and they start having a conversation with the light. And this is where some fun things start happening. They first start, many times they start noticing that this being comes across as immensely alive and full of consciousness. They describe him as pure consciousness. And then they look at themselves and they're like, looking at themselves, and they're like, wow, I'm made of the same stuff he is. They say, I'm a small ball of light. In fact, they just say, I'm a small ball of consciousness, and he's this huge, great, big ball of consciousness. And then they start realizing that they're looking at somebody they're very much a part of, that they realize that you and I are made of the same stuff, that, you're home. And they start having this sense of being back to their source, to this sense of the most accepted place that they can think of is here with the being of light. And they oftentimes have this sense of being able to remember being a part of this being and being one with this being. It's very interesting. If we were to look at these phrases, they oftentimes say, I remembered that this was home, that it was extremely familiar. I would oftentimes say that more than any other being they've ever met, they realize this being of light is the most like them of anyone they have met, even up there or down here. They feel instantly at home. And there's this great sense of familiarity, and of course you're where I came from. There's a remembering. They call him the source oftentimes, and then there's some other words that show up a lot. Is the word everything, because there's this funny blurring that happens as they start getting closer to this being of light, and they start moving in to talk to him. They start realizing that they're part of him. Now, the way you can look at this is blurring of the separation of self and other. Because as you get connected to this being of light, you start to experience the being's own experience, which the being itself is connected to everything. And so people that are connected to the being of light describe being connected to everything. And that means stars and planets and galaxies and all the different races and cultures on the earth and cities and all the trees and animals and plants and atoms. And I mean, it goes from the smallest detail of the universe, people describe subatomic particles, up to the grandest scale of galaxies and the entire universe itself. And even what was there before time began. They just describe this experience of being connected to everything. And it's this blurring that happens. Now, they do maintain themselves as a person separate from the being of light, but they're also aware that when they get close to him, they start sensing this great connection to, a large expanse of experiences. All things they talk that ever were, ever was, ever will be are there when they're talking to this being, if they choose to become aware of that. And oftentimes it just sort of happens to them. We can question whether or not this pre-existence that people begin to wonder about. They're like, wow, you feel like home. And so those of us that are listening could say, well, then they went home because that's where they came from. And there is a verse in Ecclesiastes that says that when man dies, his spirit returns to God who gave it. So there is this idea of returning to the Creator, returning to the center of everything, the source. But can you actually say that we had a life before we came here? It's very fuzzy, and it does not appear to be the case. But it can seem like it's true. I will talk in like the last video in this series, video 20, more about pre-existence and the idea of, can you choose to go back into onto the planet Earth or any place else and have another human life existence. But let's continue with this study. There is no judgment in this being of light. When you're actually meeting him, there is no sense of judgment. And that's very important for you to hear. There is no life review. There is no, what did you do with your life? You're not being asked questions. It is very much an experience of joy and oneness and friendship. I'm trying to give you the themes that show up when you're having these conversations. It is not one of great big God and little puny human being. It's one of huge ball of light talking to its own kind, and you recognize you're of the same kind. And there's this resonance. It's very mutual, and I'm always shocked at how approachable this being of light is. Very friendly, very kind, very loving, obviously, and very much happy that you're there. There is life reviews that happen oftentimes after meeting the being of light, or sometimes before you meet the being of light. And those life reviews are sort of done with other people that are closer to you. The being of light is really there offering himself as, the most attractive, most beautiful, loving person you've ever met, and people instantly fall in love with him. Okay, continuing. There is this sense of, when people meet the being of light, they're given the opportunity to interact with him, and they start to hear its thoughts towards them, and it will specifically address you and ask you questions, and you can ask it questions. And there can be visual imagery that's shared between the two of you. He speaks in your mind, and he can show you images in your mind, and you can relive things with him in your mind. It's very much just the ball of light and you sharing experiences together, but they're very real. Some people have specifically asked to actually talk to Jesus, and so Jesus does come out of this being of light, and then you can have a conversation one-on-one with Jesus if you wish. But that's only for people that ask for that. This being can take many different ways of relating to you. It can be father, it can be mother, it can be brother, it can be a great sense of other that people just are in awe of. But more than that, it's very relatable. It's so much on your level that you can feel instantly like you're with your best friend. And people immediately have these feelings of deep connection with this being of light. There is some other words that show up is that people become aware that they're a chip off this being of light, that they are a piece of it, that it and them are the same. When people meet this being of light, they oftentimes are so drawn to him that they want to like dive in, and they want to just run into him and try and join with him. And this has happened, and several people have asked for that. Not everyone does, though, so how you respond is entirely up to you. We'll get to more of that in the next video. But I can think of two instances, one where a man was standing in front of the being of light, and he asked to go inside. He says, well, can I come inside? Can I see what it's like to be inside you? And kind of like a doorway opened up, and he was invited in. Come on in. And he described a very interesting thing, and this is where I got the idea for the celestial internet that exists inside of God. Because he said he felt like he was now inside of the center of the galaxy, or a galaxy, not the galaxy, but he said this is what it looked like. And it was incredibly bright, but he could see around him in all directions pinpoints of light. Other beings, he said, each of these little pinpoints of light were other whole beings that were now all connected inside of this God, this ball of light, who he understood as God. So he says that there was this great internet, if you will, of people sharing their experiences. Every soul, every created being that ever was connected inside of God. And that this is how people could share their experiences with each other, is by communicating inside of this great being of light. And I thought that was a very interesting story. I'm trying to stay as close to what they actually said, but that's how I understood what the man said when he was describing it. Another person showed up, and what was interesting about this one is she was pure in heart, and the being of light said that to her. He says, you are pure in heart. Ask whatever you wish. And if you and she said, I want to join you. Can I come in? And he said, sure, welcome. And she kind of then described very much dissolving, she said, from a whole person into 1,000 grains of sand, and just becoming one with this being and experiencing all of its desires and its memories and its experiences, and just being flooded with this incredible knowledge of basically everything that is. And she was there for a time and described it as best she could. It's completely without words. But then she said, then a desire formed in her. And as she started feeling the wish to move to another experience, in this case, she actually wanted to see the heavenly city. Then she said she reformed all this, these little grains of sand, if you will, that kind of dispersed, all came back together, and she reformed into a solid little being of light. And then she moved out of the big ball and went on to her next experience. And so you have this idea of blending in and then reforming. So there is the experience of being completely united with the being of light and then reforming as a separate self. So those two can go back and forth depending on what your wish is. But what that does is it describes a very interesting phenomenon, and that is, somebody else used this analogy. They said that if you were to look at maybe 4 people that you know, and you see a person here, 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 it says really the best way to think of them, because of the being of light, is that we are all actually connected to each other. And we're all part of a greater whole, and this greater whole inside of God is sharing their experiences with each other, and that these separate people actually are part of a much larger being that is connecting them all together. So I just want you to hear that word connection is the reason why the golden rule is sort of the mantra of the near-death experiencing community. And that is that you want to do unto others as you would want them to do unto you, because inside of God, you're so connected to them that it's really another person that you're treating the way you're going to experience being treated inside of your experience in the afterlife. It's kind of, I don't want to say that we are another person, because that's not true. But you can live as though another person's experience was shared with you. And that's why I call it the celestial internet, where there's experiences that are, you cannot escape when you're connected to God, the reality that others are also connected to him. And in him, you can experience what they've experienced. Okay? So you get blurring of lines here, but there's clearly always a self, a you, and there's clearly always a self that is the other, God in this case. And then there's a lot of beings that are connected to God too. You basically come back to this theme over and over again when you listen to these near-death experiences. So let's talk about who he is. In the Christian tradition, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there is the equivalence of them up there. In the afterlife, the being of light is clearly God the Father, if you will. He is the largest being up there. Nobody disputes who he is, and nobody questions it. It's just a given. You know that he is the being of light. There's no one greater than the being of light. Then, if you request, you can talk to Jesus, which comes out from the being of light, and he can relate to you as one human form to another. And you can see him in his human form. He shifts a little bit. He's not always the exact same appearance, but he's very beautiful and loving. And then there is the Holy Spirit, which to me, and many people have surmised this, it is the light coming out of this being of light. It draws you to the being of light. It's very attractive, and it just showers you with love. And so, to me, this light that pervades heaven and earth and all parts of even the hellish scenes in the afterlife, this light seems to be this expression emanating off of the being of light that pervades and permeates all things. And it is this love that comes from the being of light and draws us back to it. So those are some ways of understanding the being of light. Let's talk about what he is like. What are the emotions that you experience around this being of light? And you will oftentimes experience how happy he is to see you, that he is excited that you came, that he wants to reveal more of who he is to you. And he really wants to share himself with you, and he wants you to share yourself with him. So he's highly relational. You cannot lie to him, because he can hear all of the intentions of your thoughts as you're thinking them. And he's right there with you as you're thinking your whatever thoughts or questions you have for him. He can hear them. He can answer them as soon as the question forms in you. And you cannot lie to him, because he reveals to you the lie as you're attempting to lie. And many have tried to be deceptive or be slightly evasive or to really not tell the whole truth. And he just kind of points out the fact that you're not telling him the whole truth, and so you just give up and realize it's pointless to try and lie to him. But because there's such unconditional love there, people discover that there's no shame, and he's not in any way judging you or upset or angry with you. That just helps people drop their defenses, and they begin to start trusting this new person that they just met as though he were their best friend. One thing about God is he shares his divinity with us. You see that he seems to really want us to join him and to be connected to him. He's not at all exclusive in that way. He wants to share his duties with us. That's actually seems to be very much the case, that he surrounds himself with many other light beings and angels and people who have had earthly existences, but that have endeavored to get closer to him and to serve him. And he entrusts them with all of the work of heaven, if you will. All of the work of the universe and the afterlife is given to them. And he seems to be more there for connection than he is there for running the place. He outsources that. There's a lot of other beings that are kind of like running the place. A lot of them are your peers or people who have passed on before you and have sought out different roles. He is not exclusive or greedy. He's not. He isn't into excluding. Obviously, he seems to unify all things. And you can find biblical verses that really apply to this. One of them that I find really interesting is in Colossians 1, where it says that all things were created by him, both heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created by him and through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things are held together. Beautiful passage. That's very much the being of light right there. But what I find interesting is that he is not trying to do everything himself. He just outsources it to people who are kind of doing the work for him. He himself just loves loving, and that seems to be what he's most hungry to do. He's giddy with joy that you arrived. He was so looking forward to meeting you and seeing you in person. He almost has a need to love. Many people sense that. They said, wow, he actually is so hungry and full of love and he's made of love, and he is powered by love, and he is expressing love, and love is just coming from him in all directions at all times. They cannot distinguish it. It's like love is God is just another way of describing him, and that he needs to love. It's actually something he longs to do and he hungers to do, and he gets really excited when he finds an open heart that can receive that love and lets him love them. And he also wants to be loved back. A lot of the Old and New Testament scriptures talk about glory and glorifying God, and it seems to be more about love. Nobody really describes glory as much as they do describe the fact that he wants to love, and he loves it when we love him in return. That's also a need too, is to be loved in return. And I'm careful saying that because it could sound like a codependent mom who's desperate to be loved, but he never complains or is disappointed if you choose not to, and that's very clear. He never says anything like, there's no frown on his face that people weren't able to receive love. But it has come through clearly in several NDEs that he was hungry to love. Okay, what can you ask of this being of light? Or what can you do with this being of light? What's interesting is he does seem a bit. He tells people when they leave him to go back to earth, make sure people know to ask. They're not asking for enough. Tell them to pray. Tell them that I have so much more to give, and I want to give it to them, but they have to ask. Let them know that they're not asking for enough. And I find that interesting that he's hungry to give, but he's waiting for more people to ask and to be hungry for him. So he oftentimes asks them when they actually show up, if Jesus is standing there and they're having this conversation with him, he will say, "What do you want me to do for you?" I've shared that in earlier videos. Okay, here's some interesting themes. A lot of people didn't know who God was, didn't know who Jesus was, and when they showed up there, they asked him that question, well, who are you? And now of course they know that he's God instantly, but they get curious about him, and they say, well, what are you like, and tell me about yourself. And guess what? You have the equivalent of date night with Jesus, and it's very beautiful. These people have described what it's like to go out on a date with Jesus. And where does he take them? He takes them through his universe, and he shows them galaxies and stars and supernova and beautiful planets, and he just shows them. They go flying with him through the cosmos, and they're completely enraptured, but not with the cosmos. They are paying attention to him. Now he's showing them things that he's created, but they're actually fixed on him and riveted by him, and I can't get their eyes off him because of the feeling of closeness and intimacy that they're having as he's showing them the place, basically. And they can talk together, and then they say, well, what were you like before this? And then this is where it gets really interesting. A lot of people in their near-death experiences described seeing what he was like on the earth when he lived down here and had his human existence in Jerusalem back in the early ADs. So they see him specifically on the road carrying his cross up to his crucifixion, and they are part of the audience, the crowds that are screaming and yelling and having a riot, and they describe it from several different perspectives. People, that seems to be a favorite theme of him, is to show people what it was like for him to carry that cross, and they can experience the roar of the crowd as people were yelling for him and against him and horrified at what was happening, and other people were wanting this crucifixion to happen. And so it gives people a chance to then decide, well, who do I think he is? What's interesting about one of the stories about seeing Jesus as he was going down the road up to the hill to be crucified, one woman said to him, well, you didn't forgive those people for doing that to you, did you? And it was very interesting. He could not participate in that thought. He could not stay connected to her. And the date was over. Basically, he just drove home. He just flew off and disappeared as soon as that thought went through her head, like, well, you didn't forgive those people for those awful things they did to you. He immediately disappeared. And she was aware then that that thought was not something he could accept or even participate in. And she felt really bad for having said that. And she knew that she did something wrong. She wasn't completely aware of all that she did wrong, but it kind of began to make sense to her that really hurt him for her to say that. And what was interesting is eventually she made it back to her body. The date was over. And as she was going into her body, he showed up right before she entered. And he says, "And I forgive you for misunderstanding me." And she ended up back in her body. And she tells a really powerful story. Okay, so there is this concept of pure in heart. A lot of times people who are pure in heart are treated differently in the afterlife. If you come up there with a lot of baggage, a lot of unfinished business, that your life is still a mess, maybe it was a drug overdose, or maybe you killed yourself and you hadn't really worked things through, you're encouraged to go back. You're encouraged to return to your body. You're encouraged to finish the purpose for your life, to go back to the planet and to the earth plane and finish the reason that you were there. And it's kind of revealed to you that you're not done yet, that there's so much more to learn, that you do not even have the slightest idea how to love yet. And you haven't loved well yet. So there is that feedback given. But I bring this up because those who are pure in heart seem to be invited up higher and not told to go back. They seem to be basically said, whatever you wish, ask for it. And I find that interesting because it's like they've learned what they needed to learn, or they completed enough of their life down here to where, they don't have to go back. Okay, I want to now share a perfect story about what it was like for a person by the name of D.S. Wheeler. It's a 2007 book that was written. It's an ebook. You can find it online. The name of the book is Dead is Just a Four-Letter Word. And this was a person who committed suicide. And then they showed up in front of the being of light. But they described the being of light with such perfect wording. It pictures a lot of what other NDEers talk about. She wrote this: "Now I learned it knew me. The light knew me and all I was, in all my life, in all my truth. I could not hide anything from it. I had no desire to hide anything. I felt no fear or shame that it saw all of me. It was then that I first truly understood the meaning of unconditional acceptance. It loved me the way I was made. It loved that we were meeting. It loved me with all the love that it had in it, and I knew that I was precious and treasured by it. It was perfect. I was perfectly what I was supposed to be, and it loved me just as I am. That being loved me so deeply that it would never hurt me. It only wanted my complete loving self to be the all that I am. I didn't have to hide anything but my anything anymore. I just had to be my real self. Truth lies here. We began to communicate, and I understood it was speaking to me, and I heard it address me. And then I knew that it could hear what I wanted to share with it. It was not with spoken words, but more like complete thoughts with no possibility of misunderstanding. It was a true communication of perfect understanding between two spirits. I reveled in that complete, pure communication. There was no possibility of lies, misunderstandings, or evasions. We talked for a long time, in loving joy at being together. I was small and asking questions. It was answering me, giving me what I needed to know as fast as I could conceive the questions in my thoughts. I knew that it felt joy in being with me. It felt like it felt like it was bursting with happiness because I was there. It was beyond glad to see me. I thought I was just perfectly made and was thrilled that we were together. It thought that I was perfectly made, and it was thrilled that we were together. I repeat this because it amazed me. That huge and powerful entity made me feel like being with me was why it existed. Its whole life was worth living because being with me was worth it. I was giving it joy just by being. How could someone or something I never even knew be so loving towards me? It even seemed to shine brighter when I joined it. I was so loved, small, confused, dead by my own hand, yet I was cherished and loved. I was precious to it. I responded to his thoughts with my own thoughts of joy and peace, to the love and total acceptance it was giving me. I tried to love it back with my little self. The being knew that I loved it and that I was thankful for its love for me. Then it loved me more, so I loved it more. And then this cycle of pure love between us grew. It was like the most wonderful, perfect joining of hearts between two beings you can imagine. I call it the perfect union. And with that, I will end part 1 of this Meeting the Being of Light. Stay tuned for part 2.